interests me are not just the sordid little stories of Hollywood. Somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Good evening, and welcome back, friends. Is it okay to call you my friends? I never want to jump the gun with terms like that, but it's been a few weeks now, and if you're still around and I'm still around, I would be comfortable with a label if you would. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. That said, if this is your first time coming with me on one of these little trips, then welcome. This is Between the Dial, a project where we attempt to plot a long, strange roadmap through the dark heart of Los Angeles, in the hopes of uncovering a hidden geography that sits right atop our own. Sort of like a map on top of a map. Like those old transparencies they used in school, right? You get it, anyway. And my name is Dan Watkins, if I forgot to introduce myself. Not a good way to make new friends. But as future friends, I will say that you have picked a fantastic time to join me, here, once again, on the Sunset Strip. I know it feels like we always end up here, but if you entertain that there are main arteries of dark, magical energy that run through this city, then Sunset Boulevard is certainly one of them. Sort of like the slime that ran in the sewers under Manhattan in Ghostbusters 2. Specifically, our location tonight is between two locations. We are standing next to the steep driveway of the world-famous Comedy Store, which you will see on our left. It's covered in the signatures of all the paid regulars that put in their time on its stages. Signed in bright white against the black building, and then all of that sits under the warm glow of the marquee, advertising the current crop of future comedy legends, hopefully. To our right is a much taller building, and unlike the Comedy Store, this building looks dramatically different from how it looked during the time we will be talking about tonight. Today it is called the Andaz West Hollywood, but in 1979 it was the Hyatt House. Now, we will get to why this spot between these two buildings is important soon enough. But the Hyatt House has a long and storied history that I could scratch the surface of a bit if you don't mind. It opened in 1963 and was a favorite stopover for rock stars passing through Los Angeles during a time when rock stars passed through cities like marauding hordes, leaving behind a blast zone of chaos in their wake. And the Riot Hyatt, as it was colloquially known, had chaos visited upon it on more than one occasion. Led Zeppelin would rent out 6 of the 14 floors when they came to town, and their drummer John Bonham would drive his motorcycle through the halls. The Keiths, Richard and Moon respectively, both threw TVs out of their balconies on 2 separate occasions. Lemmy Kilmister wrote his band's eponymous song on the balcony of his room at the Hyatt. Jim Morrison lived here until management kicked him out for dangling from his balcony by his fingers. And not to be outdone by these golden gods, Corey Taylor from Slipknot tried to commit suicide by jumping off of his balcony, only to be convinced otherwise. And for you keen listeners, you will know that this is the second location that we have visited to be name-checked in a Warren Zevon song, in Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me. Quote, I took her back to the Hyatt House, end quote, so on and so forth. The Comedy Store was also not always the Comedy Store. It was originally a nightclub called Ciro's, which was opened by William Wilkerson in 1940. Wilkerson was the founder of the Hollywood Reporter and the owner of the Tropicana in Las Vegas. That is until mobster Bugsy Siegel wrestled control from him. Wilkerson is also credited with having discovered Lana Turner. Fun fact. But back to his mob ties. Ciro's, in addition to being a well-known celebrity hangout, was also a well-known mob hangout. In fact, when Bugsy Siegel was in prison, he refused to eat the prison food, and instead had his meals trucked in from the Ciro's kitchen. However, Wilkerson soon grew bored of merely being a newspaper and nightclub owner. And that's when he turned his sights to his soon-to-be-doomed Vegas venture. Wilkerson sold his stake in the club to Herman Hoover and headed to the desert. Hoover, seeing the reality of operating a business in the unincorporated Sunset Strip, began to pay fellow Sunset Strip quote-unquote business owner and mob boss Mickey Cohen the standard quote protection fee. Every week, one of Cohen's employees at his clothing shop, Michael's Exclusive Haberdashery, located at 8804 Sunset, would head down to Ciro's and leave with bags of cash. The spot where Mickey's store was located would later become Tower Records. Now it's a Supreme store. An attempt on Mickey Cohen's life was actually made right out here, on the sidewalk outside of Ciro's. And though he himself did not die there, rumor is that he left behind lots of ghosts. Apocryphal lore tells of a torture room that existed in the bowels of Ciro's, where the mobsters would carry out retribution for the wrongs they had been dealt. Equally unverifiable is that this room also doubled as an illegal abortion clinic, and that one of the connected girlfriends died one night on the table. It is said that she and a man named Gus still haunt the showrooms. Eventually, the bills caught up with Hoover. Maybe it had something to do with all the payouts, and the club closed in 1960. It reopened a few years later as a rock club in 1965, but the Ciro's name was gone by 1972, when comedians Sammy Shore and Rudy DeLuca moved in and dubbed it The Comedy Store. They were a couple of old-school Vegas dudes, specifically Shore, who spent a good deal of his career on the road opening for Elvis. And the Comedy Store was their attempt to build a place where they and their friends could perform on a regular basis, work out new bits, etc. It sounded like a good idea. great location and history and what have you, but the thing is, Sammy Shore had this wife, and her name was Mitzi. And by the time Sammy opened the store, he and Mitzi weren't doing great. And by 1974, they were completely divorced. And Sammy, being the road comic that he was always looking to save some money. So in an effort to lower his alimony payments, he gave Mitzi full control of the Comedy Store. And Mitzi fucking ran with it.
From Sunset Strip in Hollywood, it's live from the Comedy Store!
First, she built a second, larger theater downstairs that sat 450 people, in addition to the 99-seater that was part of the original Ciro's. Then she built a third room upstairs from the original room called the Belly Room, where she exclusively booked female comics, in an attempt to counter the boys' club that comedy can often be. Once she shored up the home club, no pun intended, she started franchising. She built a club in La Jolla outside of San Diego. She built one in Vegas and one in Westwood as well. In addition to running the business of the store, Mitzi also installed herself as the primary talent scout and booker, during which time she would audition up-and-coming comics, usually alongside an established talent whom she trusted. In this role, it could be argued that Mitzi was directly responsible for discovering some of the most enduring voices in the history of comedy. We are talking about people like Richard Pryor, Robin Williams, Jim Carrey, David Letterman, Jay Leno, Bill Hicks, Roseanne Barr, Marc Maron. Really, the list could go on and on and on. She truly did do some great work on that front. And the work did not go unnoticed, because very soon into her tenure as owner, word got around town that the store was the place to discover comedy's next big superstar. And so the Comedy Store became a frequent haunt for Tonight Show talent bookers who mixed among the hipper of Hollywood's A-listers in the audience. Every young comedian in Los Angeles knew that if you wanted to make comedy your career, then you needed to pass at the Comedy Store. And the story I want to tell you today is about two of those young comedians. They were great friends, almost from the drop. They supported one another's work and helped each other out whenever possible. But by the time 1979 rolled its way into summer, they would be on two incredibly different paths. Those two friends were Richard Lewis and Steve Lubitkin. Now, Richard Lewis you may have heard of. Perhaps Curb Your Enthusiasm, Robin Hood Men in Tights, his many comedy specials, what have you. Steve Lubitkin, on the other hand, I would argue that if you have heard of him, then it's not because of his comedy repertoire. But we will get to that soon. First, the all-important context. Steve and Richard met as hungry young comedians, both desperately hoping to pass for Mitzi at the store. With Richard, there was no doubt. He was a natural. Steve, on the other hand, had a rocky start, but believed so strongly in himself and in his talents that he persevered. And ultimately, both of them wound up as paid regulars at the various locations in Shore's mini fiefdom. Steve shouldn't feel too bad in this. Mitzi wouldn't even pass her own son Paulie at first. And Mitzi always did have her favorites. The ones that she would invite up to her house for late-night cocaine-fueled parties. The Argus Hamiltons and Mike Binders and Biff Maynards of the world. During one such evening, Mitzi was in a bit of a sour mood. She had recently undertaken a $50,000 expansion at the Sunset Strip location to include a new showroom, dubbed the Main Room, in the hopes of attracting some of her and Sammy's old comedy friends to headline. Though she had a strong roster of up-and-coming comedians, their stylings appealed to a specific and typically younger, hipper audience. What Mitzi envisioned for the Main Room was to program a slate of recognized, nationally touring, older comedians who could cater to the older and perhaps more moneyed crowd. We're talking your Shecky Greens, Buddy Hackett's, Don Rickles's, Jerry Lewis's, and so on and so forth, but much to her chagrin, they all refused to play her club because for these comedians, the bread and butter of their touring income came from Las Vegas, and they figured performing in Los Angeles was going to hurt their draw in Nevada. Because why would you make the trip to Vegas if you could see Shecky Green up the street at Ciro's, or whatever it's called now? As Mitzi was going on and on about this problem, Argus Hamilton stopped her and proposed a solution. What if instead of putting up a single headliner in the Main Room, you put together a showcase of 5 or so comedians from your smaller room and have each of them do about 15 minutes. Call it something like the best of the Comedy Store. Surely a bill comprised of Robin Williams, David Letterman, Elaine Boozler, and Jay Leno could be worth $15 a head, even if they were not yet household names. Mitzi loved it. But there was a catch. You see, Mitzi saw the Comedy Store, specifically the small room called the Original Room, as a sort of workshop space. A place where young comedians could try out new material, hone their craft, and get noticed by the people who could make them superstars. The Main Room, however, was for performers with polished acts. It had the air of professionalism about it, and as such, any performer who headlined there was paid accordingly. The younger performers in the Original Room, however, were not paid. Or, as the old Hollywood cliche goes, they were paid in exposure. Mitzi was a tad reluctant to start paying the guys for the same set that she was getting for free in the Original Room, but that said, she ultimately did cave and began paying the guys and gals who were brought up to the Main Room. The thing with that was that once a comic was good enough for the Main Room slot, they often had irons in the fire far beyond the walls of the Comedy Store. That is to say, the money was not as important to them. Jay Leno was making a healthy living on the national club circuit. David Letterman had a holding deal with NBC, and Robin Williams was a newly minted millionaire with his Mork and Mindy money. The guys pounding the planks in the Original Room did not enjoy the same luxuries. They didn't have network money, and they were performing for free. Never was the disparity felt more than at the late-night hangouts at Cantor's Deli after the store closed. The Main Room guys would cut up over their full plates, while the Original Room crew would hover over their coffee because they couldn't afford to eat. This growing economic disparity between the upper and lower classes of the Comedy Store proceeded like this until finally the original room performers, led by comic and former Teamster Tom Dreesen, went to Mitzi and demanded to be paid for their labors. Not much, just $25 for everyone in the original room and 50% of the door for the main room. Mitzi called their bluff, but they didn't flinch. And with that began the Great Comedy Strike of 1979. And it wasn't just the original room guys on the picket line. The main room headliners too joined their comrades in solidarity. When the strike hit in 1979, Richard Lewis was doing all right. Not a household name, but he was being booked regularly and was secure in his spot and his work. Steve Lubitkin, not so much. He wrote and starred in a movie called Dante Shaco that he self-financed with a loan from his dad. It was about a man competing for the title of world's greatest man, in a series of categories ranging from physical strength to lovemaking. They held an industry screening hoping to secure distribution, but everyone in attendance passed. But it wasn't all bad news for Steve. Around that time, he got a call from the talent booker at The Tonight Show. They wanted him for a 5-minute set. That same 5-minute spot on Johnny Carson had launched a great many Comedy Store regulars into lucrative careers. People like Freddie Prinze, whose discovery at the Comedy Store really put the Comedy Store on the map as a place to be discovered. Steve was elated, as one would be, but he wanted to be prepared. So he booked a warm-up gig at another, less famous club to try out some new bits. Well, the story goes that either by chance or due diligence, someone from The Tonight Show popped into this gig and was less than impressed. The next day, Steve got a call notifying him that his appearance on The Tonight Show was canceled. Still, though, he pressed on through the defeat and lingered in the original room or at the Comedy Store's La Jolla location. That is, of course, until the strike, which pulled him off the stage altogether. Unlike the more successful comedians on the line who could get booked anywhere if they wanted, Steve, though he publicly supported the strike, privately worried that he was burning the bridge to the only stage that would have him. On top of that, Steve Lubitkin was mentally coming undone. It was clear to most around him that as May 1979 rolled around, that Steve was in the grips of a pretty severe depression. The main factor in this seemed to be his poverty. The fact that he lost his dad's money in the failure of Dante Shaco, and still faced the very real possibility that he was going to need to ask them for more money, just to cover basic living expenses. Despite this, though, he was incredibly active in the strike, and just generally battling power inequalities in the industry. This was at odds with his adoration for Mitzi, whom he still looked to for approval, all while striking her club. He would not have to fight for too long, though, as the strike would end on May 4th, after a bizarre incident in which one of Mitzi's loyalists, Biff Maynard, drove his car through the picket line, nearly hitting Jay Leno. The event had real enough is enough energy, and Mitzi finally agreed to the terms as originally laid out by Tom Dreesen. The event, however, did seem to change Mitzi Shore, in that she stopped seeing the comics as her friends, and the store as a sort of college for stand-ups. It hardened her a bit, and those who appeared on the lines faced the backlash of their spots being given away to the loyalists. Jay Leno, for instance, never set foot in the Comedy Store again. This particular aspect of the fallout hit Steve Lubitkin very hard. In a letter that he drafted but never sent to his brother and father, he enthusiastically insisted that he was on the cusp of his big break, before then asking them for money to purchase a new show suit and headshots. His depression came to a head on June 1st, 1979, when Steve walked into the Hyatt House and took the elevator to the roof. Once there, he peered over the edge at the Comedy Store next door and jumped, landing about here, where we are standing right now. On his body, he had a letter that began, quote, "My name is Steve Lubitkin, and I used to work at the Comedy Store. Maybe my death will bring about fairness," end quote. He then went on to address other important people in his life: his girlfriend Susan, his dad, his brother, and his friend Richard Lewis. He ended the note with, quote, "No revenge, please. All my love," end quote. It appears, based on the letter, that Steve was trying to frame his suicide as a political act. One meant to bring the two sides of the strike together to put away their differences. Whether or not it was truly meant as a political act, Steve's death was immediately politicized. 2 days after his death, 2 separate memorial services were held. One by those who blamed Mitzi and the strike for Steve's suicide, that was held at Humperdinck's Club in Santa Monica, and one held by Mitzi against the wishes of Steve's family at the Comedy Store's Westwood location. Whether or not Mitzi deserves any or all of the blame for Steve Lubitkin's death is yours to debate. Personally, I think it's hard in suicide to blame anyone but the person who committed it. But I also understand that the rage that is left behind in the wake of a suicide needs to be put somewhere. But as far as where we put Steve Lubitkin, he can join Gus and his female companion in the haunted back rooms of the Comedy Store. And then we can get out of here. Unless you feel like heading inside to catch the show. After fulfilling your 2-drink minimum, you're bound to see something in there worth writing home about. But when you write home, don't ask for headshot money. Feels a little distasteful after the fact. Well, whatever you do, drive safely. Between the Dial was written and produced by me, Daniel Watkins. If you are interested in hearing more of me talk and love scary movies, then you can still catch our project Monster Hump Day. Christina Santa Cruz and I are hosting horror movies every Wednesday for the rest of November on landturtlerecords.com. That's landturtlerecords.com. You can check out everything else we do over there as well. And if you're interested in following me on social media, you can do so at Epcot Fitzgerald. That's Epcot, _Fitzgerald on Instagram. Have a good night, y'all.